Welcome to the fourth episode of the Sydney Contrarian, titled How the Housing Affordability Problem is Fast Turning into a Possible Perfect Storm. This episode follows from the second episode and extends to the housing affordability problem, something that is getting increasing coverage in the news the past 3 years as property prices continue to climb sharply, especially in Sydney and Melbourne. The housing affordability problem is best described as how property prices are rising above that of the income and savings level, especially that of the first home buyers, and thus locking them out. As more investors, those who own properties to rent out or buy to generate capital gains, use their existing properties to purchase new properties, they threaten first home buyers who only have their own savings and perhaps some help from their parents to make their first deposit and therefore try to buy their first home. The consequences of reducing housing affordability can be catastrophic both financially and socially. From a social perspective, the housing market is pivotal to the strength of the national economy as it is a significant store of private wealth. Also, it creates a stable society because many young men and women consider housing ownership before getting married as a key priority to starting a family. Furthermore, there is a great need to have a stable housing market to ensure that there is equality of wealth in society. From a financial perspective, the housing market is tied to the banking system, with mortgages being a significant proportion of bank revenues, and its stability is required to ensure the general economy remains stable. The housing market also contributes to a significant number of jobs, including in the construction sector, property management, sales through real estate, and also in investment. So how is housing affordability becoming a problem? And what are the indicators that may suggest things are not well? We'll look into this in some detail with a focus on the Sydney property markets. The media often talks about housing affordability in terms of the number of years of average income required to buy an average house in the 8 major Australian cities. Currently, an average house in Sydney is just over 10 years of average income. In Melbourne, just under 8, with Hobart being the most affordable at about 5 years of average income. Now, the measure itself, you might look at this graph and go, well, so what? Like, because, okay, Sydney's more unaffordable than Hobart and all the other major cities. But how does that matter to an individual if housing prices are going to go up? Or if housing prices could go down? This housing affordability measure doesn't really tell us what's going to happen in the future. But let's dig into the house prices and income growth over time to see that the housing affordability is indeed a problem. And at this point, we will focus on Sydney properties specifically, where the housing affordability problem is of greatest concern. Let us again return to the comparison of Sydney property price growth against that of the average income of a Sydney worker. I'm not going to go into the detail in this graph as it has been discussed in episode 2. But again, the key point remains that the housing affordability problem is increasing given that house prices have increased so sharply relative to income growth. To purchase a house in 1999 would have required less income in terms of annual income, and it would have been much lower in 1986 before the first rise in the property prices in 1989. Now, this next graph provides us with a comparison in the trend of the growth of average income in Sydney against the Housing Affordability Index. This graph shows us that the average income has grown relatively steadily from $23,000 in 1986 to $85,000 in 2016. But more notably is that the Housing Affordability Index is rising despite the rise in average income. In other words, even as Sydney-siders are earning more income over time, property prices are rising much faster. Thus, that is why more young people are being priced out of the housing market. They can either choose to rent or take out a much larger mortgage in order to fulfill their dreams of owning their own home. Somewhere down the track, that is. Hopefully, before they retire. The reason is, if you have a mortgage, you don't actually own your own home. The bank owns that home. You have to actually earn it back, pay the bank, and then the bank will hand you the title deed when the mortgage is paid off. Now, on the topic of mortgages, we should ask ourselves the question, how does the housing affordability problem impact on an average mortgage of a first home buyer? I have taken 5 case studies over the past 30 years to illustrate the size of an average mortgage that may be taken to purchase an average property, and also how long it may take to pay down the entire loan. I assume an upper middle class family that is putting a 20% deposit and is able to make a monthly repayment equivalent to 70% of the average Sydney workers pay in order to pay off the mortgage. In today's terms, we may be considering an upper middle class household to be earning an annual pre-tax income of $180,000. They'll be making annual repayments of almost $60,000, which would not actually be too much of a burden for them. And that is by the definition that if a household is paying more than 40% of their pre-tax income on housing costs, then they will be considered to be facing significant financial burden on their housing costs. I assume the actual mortgage rates charged by banks over the period in my calculations, so the historical mortgage rates apply to my study. Where repayments extend beyond 2016, I have assumed that banks will charge an annual rate of 5.4% per annum, which is the rate charged today. Of course, banks are likely to raise mortgage rates going forward, having done it recently on fixed rate mortgages. So expect that the analysis that I have here for more recent purchases of a house are probably a little bit optimistic. So as we can see, an upper middle class family will be able to pay off their mortgage in around 8 years if they have purchased a home prior to 2000. As property prices rose sharper after the turn of the millennium, such a mortgage would take 16 years if they purchased a home in 2006, a year before the subprime crisis, or a little lower at 13 years if they purchased a home in 2011. Now, the reason why a home buyer would take longer to repay a mortgage in 2006 than in 2011 if they purchased it is that while house prices rose more between 2006 to 2011, the RBA actually raised interest rates from 2006 to mid-2008, and this was in the earlier stages of a person who bought on their mortgage if they bought a house in 2006. This would have led to greater strain on the homeowner because each monthly repayment would require higher payments of interest and less repayments of the loan. Now, looking into 2016, a comparable mortgage would be even more onerous, taking 19 years to repay. So what's so significant about these findings? One thing is that baby boomers had it easier than today for the generation X, Y, and millennials when it comes to home ownership. The baby boomers can argue that they lived in periods of double-digit interest rates. Great, they did. And they say, oh, well, if they can survive us, then so can we. But the case studies here showed that the younger generation today will have it much tougher in owning their own home, despite lower mortgage rates and rising income. What happened is that as interest rates fell, banks made home loans more accessible, property prices rose even more as a result, and I'm not even talking about the influx of overseas property investors, the increasing amounts of television and printed media ads that is basically talking up the property market and making people who had not really had an intention to rush into buying a home to do so. So it is actually a case of as rising prices continue, it's actually causing a greater demand. Finally, this graph shows us how the total amount paid for the entire mortgage, the average rate of interest paid, and the time taken to repay the mortgage for all the 5 cases. We can see that in 1986, interest rates were high. It was on average over the term of the loan, 13%. But the homeowner would have only spent $134,000 to repay a loan of almost $80,000. The total interest paid is 34% of the house price. For 1996, they would have spent a total of $230,000 as interest rates fell to 7% on average. Now, what is striking is paying down a mortgage on a house purchased over the past decade. The total amount paid on the loan that is actually interest to the bank has increased from 34% in 1986 to 50% of the loan. Banks may have charged lower interest rates, but the bigger loan means they earn more interest over the entire term of the mortgage. They have it pretty, don't they? As for today's houses, the family would have to borrow $720,000 and eventually pay a total of $1.15 million. Hey, interest rates have fallen to a low of 5.4%, but the interest component itself would be almost 60% of the mortgage, and the amount itself, being almost $400,000, is very large. It's almost equivalent to another small unit. And the mortgage would take almost 20 years to pay down. Not an exciting prospect. Now, wrapping up for this episode, I hope you can see that the property market price rise in Sydney, and hence housing, has become increasingly out of reach for first home buyers. This can actually be seen in 2 ways. Now, the first one is the most commonly presented point of view that the mainstream media keeps telling you, and the real estate agents keep telling you, you better get in early and have your parents help you with the first deposit, because the trends show you you will miss the boat if you delay. The alternative, which I believe banks and baby boomers and the real estate agents don't want to hear, is that this property market is a bubble, has been a bubble, and it is a catastrophe long in the making. Well, the alternative view is obviously unpopular, makes you look stupid if you go and talk about it in parties, because it goes against historical trend, and one can continue to argue that governments and banks for a very long time have stepped in, propped up the markets, and hey, where's a crash? Haven't seen it. That's all well and good, okay? But when they have tools and strategies in the past that they've used, like negative gearing, mortgage redraw accounts on your home loan, better capital controls on banks on lending, and increasing number of entry-level apartments, well, they're going to be able to keep this going for a little longer until they can't. But the problem is that these are measures to keep property prices from falling, rather than addressing the problem that people are facing greater financial strains on their housing costs. The problem is that you can argue if house prices keep rising, just jump in, ride the wave, and then sell down later down the track and you'll be okay. There is a name for such a scheme, a Ponzi scheme. And we all know that no Ponzi scheme is invincible. In fact, for each Ponzi scheme that lasted for so long, the damage it caused when it collapsed is just that more disastrous. Sure, this Ponzi scheme has gone on for so long, and you can throw in all the factors now that there's Chinese buyers, land shortages to justify why I am wrong. However, you have seen the figures. What supports a healthy property market to grow is income growth, not debt. And we have been living on more debt than our grandchildren can repay. To end with a bit of black humor, while some of us may look forward to inheriting some wealth from our parents, the coming generations will be inheriting their parents' debt. And I don't think they're going to be thanking their parents for it. Well, that's it from the Sydney Contrarian. Stay tuned for a future episode. And once again, God bless.